Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad, and then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortune he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. It is the 3rd of November on the afternoon in a particularly foul day on the latter part of 2023 here in England, or perfidious Albion if you prefer. And we're here today slightly earlier than usual, partly because I have to get up very early tomorrow morning, but also because I wanted to do an immediate reaction to the speech of Hassan Nasrallah, the General Secretary of the Hezbollah movement, and the impact of this. And as always with historic speeches, it's only probably in the light of many months or years afterwards that its full implications will be understood. But I wanted to jump on immediately and give my initial impressions as to where this is going. So I'm just going to place the advertisement for the stream in the relevant locations. So we are live on Odyssey, Rumble, and YouTube at the moment. YouTube hasn't kicked us off yet, but then again, with the way that the British reactionaries are foaming at the mouth and calling everybody a terrorist at the moment, who knows, maybe we'll all be in prison by this time next week. Here's hoping. So here we are on the day in which Nasrallah, well, according to the Western press, broke his silence, though as he pointed out in the speech, the response of the Hezbollah movement was immediate and has been significant. So what did he actually say? We'll get to that in just a moment, but before that I will look at who is in the chat at the moment. Let me just call that up here. Okay, so we've got Dingo Ate Me Baby, good afternoon to you. Tobias, good afternoon to you. And to Austin. Rob, good afternoon. Carmo, hello to you. Lee, Good afternoon to you, Peter, my fellow resident of Perfidious Albion. Irish Partisan, our comrade in Minsk, says, good evening, comrades, getting ready for the 7th of November celebration of the Great October Socialist Revolution, which is a public holiday here in Belarus. And as we've said before, Belarus is a more free country than Britain. Hello to Tony and Red Star Betty. Good afternoon to Will Johnson. So, no matter which platform that you are on, I'll just see if anybody's there on any of the others. No, we're clear so far. So, we are looking today at the speech that Hassan Nasrallah just gave with regard to the situation in Gaza. And it was a very interesting speech because essentially it defied the expectations of those, what I'll identify as adrenaline junkies looking for a hit. But anybody who is with the half a brain reading it could easily see what he was actually aiming at. And he applauded the Operation Al-Aqsa flood. He saluted that and said it was an entirely Palestinian affair, that the other members of the axis of resistance, so Hezbollah, Syria, Iran, weren't aware of it and didn't have anything to do with it. That's been said on numerous occasions before, that the Joint Operations Command in Gaza had planned this in such strict secrecy that it's doubtful even if the Hamas political leadership based in Qatar actually knew it was going to happen. There's doubts as to whether Ismail Haniyeh, the political leader of Hamas, actually knew what the hell was going on, that this was something that was done in such great secrecy by the Hamas military formation, the Al-Qassam brigades, by the other by Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who are the group that are actually closer to Iran, by the Marxist-Leninists in the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and the other Marxist-Leninist groups, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and some other groups in Gaza as well, that they planned this in the strictest of secrecy, so much so that nobody was aware it was going to happen. Not even the political leaders of Hamas itself knew it was going to happen, because they know very well that the Israelis and the Americans, of course, and we'll come to what Nasrallah had to say about them in a moment, have intelligence assets everywhere. They have spies everywhere. They work round the clock to penetrate the operations of Hezbollah and Hamas and all the resistance movements. And so any wider knowledge of what they were going to do on October the 7th would have meant that more about it would have come out. Now, they say that the Egyptians warned the Israelis like the day before that something might be about to happen, but that's a little bit too late for them to effectively counter it. So I wasn't surprised that Nasrallah says they didn't know it was coming. I'm convinced that the Hamas political leadership didn't know it was coming either. So he applauded the action that took place on October the 7th and said it was going to be something that left the Zionist regime in even more of a weak position than it previously had been, that it had thrown the situation facing the Palestinians back globally center stage, that the Americans and the Israelis were trying to bury the Palestinians under a weight of new occupation, new settlements being implanted into the West Bank, and that this had now all been defeated, which it has. It's a bloody fight going on, but the Israelis, as Nasrallah said, have already suffered a defeat. And he went on to make a number of interesting points about the nature of Israel itself, which I find on a, perhaps the level of personal satisfaction, a small element of it is that Nasrallah identifies Israel in the same way that a Marxist-Leninist would do, which is that he sees it clearly and he identifies it in his speech as being an American operation, an American colonial operation that he correctly identifies as beginning with what he called the wretched Balfour Declaration of 106 years ago. So this is a confirmation that the most effective national liberation group in the Middle East over the last 40 years clearly sees what Israel is. They don't see it as an independent entity, and it's not. And Nasrallah clearly stated in his speech some other things that were undeniably true, that the Americans rushed to prop up the Zionist regime, which is why they rushed all those military assets to the Middle East. They rushed it there in a panic because they were worried that the Israeli regime was going to implode or turn in on itself. And they had to get all those military assets in place to shore up, to give a public shoring up of the Israeli state. That's what it's about. As I've said on numerous times before, they can't wage war on Iran using what they've got sat in the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. They can try and launch bombing campaigns, but then, as Nasrallah indicated in his speech, that would mean the rapid end of all of their bases in the Middle East, so especially the ones that the Iranian-aligned forces in Syria and Iraq can get to. And Nasrallah also said that he said, well, you've sent all these aircraft carriers and you've made all these threats about what will happen if we get involved. Well, we're not afraid of you, he said. And he correctly brought to mind the early 1980s where Hezbollah, in its earliest incarnation, carried out the truck bombing of the US Marine barracks in Beirut, forcing the Americans out. Reagan, the great fake hero Ronald Reagan, an actor playing the president, scuttled out of Lebanon, withdrew the US Marine Force there. They were that early incarnation of Hezbollah defeated the United States, as Nasrallah was careful to remind them. He said that the men who defeated you in the 80s are still around, as are their sons, as are their grandsons. So clearly sending an indication there to the United States that essentially, well, if you really want to use that, do it. We're not. He's essentially echoing a phrase of Mao, really, where Mao said, if war with the imperialists should come, first of all, we are against it. Secondly, we are not afraid of it. So whether Nasrallah knows it or not, and I suspect that he does, he's drawing on a phrase from the great Chairman Mao there. But more broadly, people were expecting Nasrallah to declare war immediately and say, the invasion begins now, brothers, pull out a sword, and the camera pans out and he rides off on a horse towards the Israeli border. Of course, he's not going to do that. Because Hezbollah's position in Lebanese politics is an interesting and a complicated one. First of all, they are the national liberation movement inside Lebanon that drove out the Israeli occupiers after an 18-year-long military campaign. So you had the Lebanese civil war, you had the Israeli invasion of Lebanon to try and eliminate the PLO, you had the horrific massacres that were carried out under the control of Ariel Sharon when he was defense minister, which even an Israeli internal inquiry found that he was at least indirectly responsible for, because the Israelis were, of course, allied with this group called the Phalange, who were essentially a fascist militia organization run by Lebanese Christians. And that's who Israel was allied with in Lebanon, as a fascist comprador clique in Beirut and other places. And so Hezbollah come into existence in South Lebanon amongst predominantly the Shia population to oppose this Israeli occupation. And they became incredibly effective at fighting the Israelis, to the point where Ehud Barak, the friend of Jeffrey Epstein, lest we forget, when he was prime minister, eventually pulled out of most of South Lebanon and abandoned the occupation there, apart from a couple of small areas, one of which is called the Shibar Farms, which has been the subject of exchanges of fire between Hezbollah and Israel over the course of the last 3 weeks. But the point I wanted to emphasize was that between the earliest incarnation of Hezbollah in 82 and the final pull out of the Israeli occupation forces in 2000, that's 18 years. That's a long game. And that was a long period of resistance and a lot of political obstacles to be overcome, including the sectarian constitution imposed upon Lebanon by the imperialists at the end of the Lebanese civil war that sought to not address the sectarian problems within Lebanon, but to institutionalize them. Just the same way, in case you were wondering, that they institutionalized sectarianism and religious division in the so-called settlement that they did in Bosnia. And they did that to basically make sure that the Balkan region, the former Yugoslavia, is and remains as weak and divided as possible in order that it can be more effectively controlled or destroyed. So that's why they did the settlement that they did inside Lebanon. And yet, through all of this, Hezbollah, under the leadership of Nasrallah, were able to navigate through this and were able to reach a point in 2000 where they liberated the territory of Lebanon. And then, of course, 6 years later, were able to reach the point where they inflicted an embarrassing defeat on the Israelis from which they've never really recovered, and were able to defeat them in a land war. And they defeated them by basically holding fast in their position on the Lebanese border and inflicting too many casualties for the Israelis to bear, and they had to have the US bail them out by, as Norman Finkelstein has observed, having Condoleezza Rice run off to the UN and pass a resolution through there, which of course still damaged Lebanon's sovereignty, because Lebanon is still having imperialist intervention inflicted upon it to a degree with the intervention of the so-called UNIFIL force, which is a UN military force which is sat on the Lebanese border. And the objective, of course, of the imperialists is to destroy Hezbollah if they can. That's why a lot of people in Lebanon think that the imperialists or the Israelis or both were behind the enormous and destructive bomb blast on the docks in Lebanon a few years ago, if you remember that one, which was meant to be fertilizer exploding, but no one's ever really believed that it was. And they've tried various different methods to destabilize Lebanon, to put pressure on different political factions, to push it back into civil war in order to weaken Hezbollah, and they haven't succeeded so far. Hezbollah's popularity has consistently grown over the years, and it has allies in the other areas of Lebanon. And of course, it has a lot of prestige attached to it now, even amongst groups that would previously have been thought of as its enemies, such as the certain elements of the Christian and the Sunni Muslim population of Lebanon, many of whom have now joined the broader group of forces that Hezbollah has organized. So this is a powerful national liberation organization, possibly the most powerful national liberation organization in the world. It's not simply a puppet of Iran or anything like that. And it's something that the Israelis fear and that the American imperialists fear, and with good reason. It has beaten both of them. And so, going back to the substance of Nasrallah's speech and why I give all of that background as necessary for understanding what he's saying, he says at one point that the defeat of the Israelis and the victory of Gaza is in the national interest of Lebanon. And what does he mean by that? He's making an appeal there to the broader Lebanese population. I mean, there was thousands and thousands out to see the speech in a square in southern Beirut already. But he's making an appeal beyond the strongest constituency in that Hezbollah has already, which is the Shia Muslim community inside Lebanon. And he's appealing to the rest of the Lebanese population. And what he's arguing is quite correct, because he said some things like this before. He is making the point that that not only is part of Lebanese territory still occupied, even if it's just a small part, by the Israelis, but also the existence of Israel, and this is why he mentioned the Balfour Declaration, is designed by the imperialists to make sure that the sovereignty of Lebanon can never be fully realized whilst the Zionist colonial project exists there, because it's there basically to hold a quite literal gun to the head of any government in the region that doesn't please the imperialists. They can set the Israelis on them, have their economies undermined in the usual way, increase military pressure on them. This is what Israel is there to do. And Nasrallah is making that point. He's addressing the people in Lebanon who might not be entirely convinced of the potential future need for greater military operations against Israel. He's addressing them, and he's saying that he, as the leader of Hezbollah, as the leader of this anti-imperialist, anti-colonial force, this nationalist force, is going to he's already engaged in this fight. The Hezbollah is already engaged in this fight against Israel, and it is in the interests of Lebanese sovereignty that the fight in Gaza and the fight against the Zionists is successful. And he's also addressing, and this is why he didn't wade in and start denouncing the leaders of the Arab countries, though of course he did, rather more subtly than that, say that they were not delivering the requisite amount of solidarity with the Palestinians. But he made an appeal to the leaders of Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and other Arab countries, and he says that the resistance in Iraq and the Nasrallah movement in Yemen has already joined the fight, as have various groups in Syria. So he asks the Egyptian rulers and the Jordanians and the Saudis, well, the Houthis, as they're called, or the Nasrallah, has already joined the fight. And yet, why is it that the Egyptian government can't even keep the Rafah border crossing open? Why is it that they can't even do that? So he's not calling for the overthrow of al-Sisi or anything. He's just pointing out the weakness and collaborationist nature of the Egyptian regime and the Jordanian regime. And so he says also to the Arab, he's addressing the Arab leaders, and he says, well, why can't you at least come together and try and force a ceasefire? Why can't you at least do that? And so what he's doing is he's addressing the masses in those countries. He's addressing the people far beyond Lebanon now. He's saying to them, well, look at the state of your leaders. Look at the leaders of Jordan. Look at the leaders of Egypt. If the leadership in Yemen can launch a war on Israel and isn't afraid to do so, no matter, even if that means you launch a war on Israel, you're basically launching a war on the United States and the US imperialists themselves. Why can't the leadership in Cairo even keep the border crossing open? Why can't the Jordanian king do more than just verbally protest? So that's what he's doing. He's not addressing the leaders there, really. He's addressing the masses, because Nasrallah understands the reason why the Israelis haven't been able to meet their objectives and won't meet their objectives. It's because, as he says, it's the strength of the resistance of the Gazan people, the Palestinian people, that will prevent the Israelis meeting their goals. And what do I mean by that? I will return to what we've discussed previously here, which is the original plan, now confirmed apparently via leaks from the Israeli government, because the plan seems to have been shelved for now. What was the initial plan of the Israelis? And, well, let's follow Nasrallah's example and just say what was the plan of the US imperialists. It was what is referred to it's a phrase I don't like, but I have to use it. It's a term called ethnic cleansing, which we've mentioned before. And this came into popular usage during the 90s, if you recall, when this is what the West, what the US imperialists were accusing principally the Serbs of doing in Bosnia. Is they accused some Croats of doing it as well in Croatia, which is mass transfer or mass expulsion of a population. So mass expulsion of the Serbian population from Croatia. Various Croat commanders of a lower-ranking level have been charged with that at the International Criminal Court. This is what they were charging Radovan Karadzic with This is what they were charged Mladic with. It's also what they charged Slobodan Milosevic with, along with a load of other things. But one of the big things that they said that these Serb leaders were guilty of was exactly what the US imperialists were planning to do to the population of Gaza, and that is described as ethnic cleansing. Now, you can't soft pedal around that. You can't call that anything other than what it is, because the imperialists themselves have set out the standards. They said that those Serbs and those Croats who did the forced population transfers in the former Yugoslavia are guilty of ethnic cleansing. Okay, well then, Tony Blinken and Joe Biden and certainly Benjamin Netanyahu are all guilty of plotting ethnic cleansing. That was their first option. And they only abandoned it because the masses in Egypt were so opposed to it. Not al-Sisi. Al-Sisi, if they gave him a big enough bribe, would have indulged it. But he was too afraid of the response of the Egyptian masses to go through with that ghastly plan. And also the resistance of the Palestinian masses themselves is too strong. They have refused to leave. They've refused to flock to the border. They've refused to run away. And as Nasrallah indicates in his speech, this is because that they are as one with the resistance, and their will to fight is incredible. And they refuse to be pushed out of their land. And this is what made Keir Starmer's weaselly and greasy speech the other day even more horrendous than it initially read as, because they know that if they are thrown out, that they will not be allowed back, no matter how many so-called guarantees Joe Biden and Tony Blinken babble on about. And so the resistance of the masses of the Palestinians bearing up under unbelievable horror and criminality being forced on them, and unbelievable amounts of mass murder forced on them by the Israeli regime, with US imperialism pulling the strings. That resistance is what will defeat the Israeli regime. So far, this military advance into Gaza, according to the journalist Elijah Manier, who were currently trying to organize having him on the program next week, the Israeli advance into Gaza, they've picked like avenues that they think are going to be the easiest to take so far, and to do basically showpiece advances to look as if they're meeting their objectives. And they've still taken a large number of casualties, and they're still getting embarrassed by like the now famous footage of the Al-Qassam fighters jumping out of a tunnel entrance, running up to a Merkava tank, placing a homemade improvised explosive device on the tank's side, which apparently is designed to cripple the tank's electronic warning systems, so it can't detect incoming rocket-propelled grenades. So they knock out the electronic warning system, and they run back, pick up a rocket-propelled grenade, and they fire two off at the tank. And because its detection system is crippled, it seriously damages it, if not knocking it out. So if you've got people, and we've seen many videos of similar degrees of not only bravery but skill, real skill in approaching how to cripple these high-tech vehicles. If you've got people en masse who are prepared to do that, then the Israeli regime can't win. If you've got the masses of the Palestinian population in Gaza who will not flee, who will not run away, who are prepared to stay and to be as one with their national liberation fighters, then the Israelis cannot win. And Nasrallah's speech reflected that, because he understands that, because this is the same process that the Lebanese people went through in their long war to rid themselves of the Israeli occupation in the south of Lebanon. So no matter how much horror, and they can inflict a lot of horror, the US imperialists can rain down upon Gaza, the strength of the resistance is undamaged so far. And Nasrallah observes that, and of course he welcomes it. And we all need to bear that in mind as well. Because if you sit here in front of your computer or on your phone, just scrolling through images of horrific mass murder, which is what it is, every single day, then you're going to reach a point where you just fall into despair, because that's what just viewing that all day will do to you without the proper political understanding. And what Nasrallah understands, because he has led this struggle, and what others who are involved in the region, like the Yemenis, understand, is that these wars of national liberation against a technologically superior but politically weaker opponent, these are always horrific and bloody affairs. We've said it before when we look back at the Algerian independence struggle, which is perhaps why the Algerians are so unified in solidarity with the Palestinians. It cost 1 million Algerian lives throughout the course of that almost 20-year war. There was horrific massacres done by the French imperialists, starting in 1945. I mean, probably a lot, even earlier as well, back into the 30s and the 20s, but let's take it from 1945, where, as Frantz Fanon outlines in his work, the French killed 45,000 people in one campaign of repression across a couple of months in 1945, ordered, as I said the other day, by the great hero de Gaulle. Again, like the French killed anything up to 200,000 in Madagascar just a couple of years later. Look at the number of like unbelievably bloody massacres the British carried out in India, or the German Empire under the Kaiser carried out in Namibia. But even if you just look at North Africa and the French, unbelievable horror that they inflicted upon the Algerians, and the Algerians still won in the end. And this is what all the great revolutionaries of the last century understood, was that if you are going to wage a campaign for national liberation against the imperialist forces, they are going to try in the most bloody fashion possible to break the will of the resistance. They are going to try and break the population away from you by committing unbelievable acts of barbarity and inflicting mass casualties. This is exactly, by the way, what the Nazis did in Eastern Europe, and to a much lesser degree in France as well. There's a famous example of a village in France where, because I think 1 or 2 Nazi soldiers were killed, they leveled the whole village and killed everybody in it. So this is how the imperialist forces always waged war. The Israelis did not invent this. The US imperialists did not invent this. They inherited it from the European imperial powers. And again, Nasrallah is a man at the head of a movement who have successfully prevailed against such a horror. And now the Palestinians are enduring this horror as well. And enduring it, indeed, they are. So it's understandable why people in the West, looking at this, they see all this misery and they freak out and get angry and expect, and they want some big thing to be announced that will sweep away the horrors of Israeli colonialism and Zionism, and will sweep away the horrors of US imperialism. And that's perfectly understandable. It's an entirely correct response to have. But the way in which you've got to look at it is to follow the advice of, well, Putin himself, actually, because he's correct when he made this observation the other day. He said, if you're looking at this and reacting emotionally, you're going to make incorrect decisions. And he's right. Now, you can argue about the rights and wrongs of Putin's government, but there's no denying that he's correct about that. And now, of course, the people demanding that Nasrallah immediately go to war and all of that, a lot of these, in the West at least, there's similar types of people who were demanding that Putin nuke Kiev or something like that, or that he immediately reduce Lvov to ashes. Well, can you imagine what would have happened if he'd have done that? I mean, this is worth mentioning in passing, but the number of civilian casualties in Gaza alone have already surpassed the civilian casualties as a result of, or have arisen via the increased military action through the special military operation. And as has been pointed out, a lot of those civilian casualties have actually come from Ukrainians still shelling and bombing Donbass. So it's actually NATO forces who have committed quite a lot of those, or have caused quite a lot of those civilian casualties. So this is what you have to bear in mind, that the way in which that the Nasrallah and the others are proceeding is in a incremental level of escalation. And by not just wading in there and saying, now war to the finish, come on Netanyahu, let's sort it out man to man, or something silly like that, what Hezbollah are doing is, first of all, they're aiming to take the bulk of the Lebanese population with them, in terms of showing them that it is in their own interest to be in solidarity with the Palestinians. Nasrallah also pointed out that by engaging the Israeli army in the way that they have been doing, by knocking out their surveillance equipment, by continually exchanging fire with them, not only have they killed a good number of Israeli armed forces, the Hezbollah has suffered at least 50 killed in action themselves, but they've forced the Israelis to redeploy significant numbers of forces to the northern border and keep them away from the fight in Gaza, including some of the better divisions in the Israeli army. And they'll have to keep them redeployed up there, because Nasrallah went on to say that all of the options are still on the table, that a ceasefire should be arranged, and he put that upon the Arab leaders and basically said to them, well, go and arrange a ceasefire then. Why can't you do that? Now, these people were reporting in the Western press that he called for a ceasefire. What he actually said, according to my reading of it, please do chime in if you think I've got this wrong. What he actually said was that a ceasefire could be arranged. He said two things. He said, first of all, that the US imperialists could end it today if they wanted to. He's correct about that. Of course, they probably won't. But also that the Arab leaders should push for a ceasefire, and that this should be something that they should be capable of. Of course, they won't, because that would involve a headlong collision with US imperialism. So what he's done there is essentially he's put before the great Arab masses as a couple of points for them to consider, to saying, well, look, first of all, the US is the main enemy here, which is true. Second of all, why can't these leaders in Jordan, in Egypt, in Saudi, why can't they force a ceasefire here? Why can't they do that? Now, of course, that puts increasing pressure on Cairo, on Riyadh, and on Oman, and the masses in those countries will hear it. Now, I saw an interesting thing today from a video that reportedly came from inside Saudi Arabia. I say reportedly because I don't speak Arabic. I can say precisely two Arabic words, la and shukran. If you put them together, that means no thank you. But it is purported to be from somebody inside Saudi Arabia who's saying that the displays of the Palestinian flag and acts of solidarity and prayers of solidarity with Palestine are forbidden under Saudi law still. So this is the nature of the Riyadh regime. All their talk about, Islamic solidarity and all that and brotherhood, it's all tripe. It's all guff. Yeah, the only thing that they will ever do is if they are under unbelievable pressure themselves. And Nasrallah aimed in his speech, I think, in a subtle way, to place more pressure upon Mohammed bin Salman, upon King Abdullah of Jordan, and General Sisi in Egypt. Sisi, by the way, is a Saudi creature. He was elevated to the presidency of Egypt in part thanks to the maneuverings of the Saudi intelligence services. So that's the nature of the guy that you're dealing with there. But he sought to elevate the pressure upon them. And he further said, addressing this time the imperialists, that, as I say previously, all options are on the table, that they are going to continue to engage the Israelis, and that they will judge accordingly as to what is happening. So we can see here that that what he's done is he's outlined the direction of travel. He's outlined that Hezbollah sees it as in the interests of not just themselves, but all of Lebanon, that the Israeli regime and US imperialism are defeated in Gaza. he's made an appeal to the populations of the Arab regimes that are ruled by the comprador elements by saying to them, well, why can't these leaders do anything for the Palestinian population? Why are they so impotent? Why can't they even force a ceasefire? He's given essentially a political lesson to everybody in the region. He's pointed clearly to say, well, look at how weak the Israeli regime is. Look at how he compared it to a spider's web, because he correctly points out just how much military hardware that the US has to move into the region just to prop up the Israeli state. And I'll add this into the mixture here. The way in which the US has now moved, apparently, and this is, the numbers here are contested, but there's anything up to 5,000 American military personnel on the ground in Israel. Apparently, some of them are participating in the raids on Gaza. We don't know that for certain as yet, but what we do know is that an American three-star general is advising the Israeli military. So the Americans, as Nasrallah observed, are taking more and more direct control of Israel. There was a story that came out the other day about the fact that the Americans are preparing to set up a permanent base for themselves in the Negev desert. That, again, does not bode well for Israel, because what it means is, and again, Nasrallah also mentioned that the campaign inside Syria and in Iraq has been intensifying, and we know that the Iraqi resistance that's aligned with both Iran and Hezbollah have announced that they intend to fully liberate Iraq. Now, what does that mean? That means chasing the Americans out. And that means that, and they've been intensifying their attacks on the American bases. And again, this is a slow escalation. It's not 1 to 100. It's 1 to 10, 10 to 20, 25, 20 to 25, etc. But the pressure on the Israeli regime and its American imperialist master increase bit by bit by bit, and they get more and more stretched. Now, with the entry of Yemen, they're stretched down into the Red Sea, with the Iraqis demonstrating that they can reach the Red Sea port, Eilat, I think it's called. That stretches the Americans and the Israelis even further. And this is what Nasrallah is pointing towards. Every time the Israelis escalate their attacks on Gaza, there will be more pressure bit by bit exerted upon them. And Nasrallah's thinking, and I'm presuming that this is thinking shared in the governmental circles of Tehran, is that the more that this pressure is dialed up, that eventually the American imperialists are going to quit. They're going to run off to the UN to beg for a ceasefire. Blinken gave a speech just before I came on air here where he was sort of waffling and wavering all over the place, claiming that they never wanted to expel the Palestinians, claiming that the Palestinians are caught in the crossfire between Hamas and Israel. Blinken is pretty dumb, but I don't think he's stupid enough to believe what he's saying. Again, to make the point that everybody should understand, which is that the National Liberation Army that exists within Gaza is not only integrated into the population, it's impossible to uproot it from the population. The strength of support for it will only be increasing, not just in Gaza, but in the entirety of occupied Palestine, in the West Bank, in even the Arab citizens of Israel itself, who are being subjected to massive amounts of racism from the ultra, not even the ultra right wingers in Israel, but standard Israelis. So this is the way in which things are going. That the Northern Front is going to keep on absorbing large amounts of Israeli resources. That if Hezbollah find it necessary to dial this up, they can do, and that the Arab reactionaries essentially have been given a notice to exert pressure. He also mentioned the oil trade as well, that if they value their own thrones, so to speak, that they better start exerting pressure on the US to ultimately call a halt to the Israeli Gaza occupation. And if they don't do that, then I'm sure that the resistance forces in the form of Hezbollah and others will dial things up even further. So it's a very interesting speech, one that it bears watching and rewatching. It's very politically astute in how Nasrallah addresses his appeals. A lot of it is dressed up in Islamic rhetoric and verses from the Quran, but you analyze it and you take those out. It's easily a speech that could be given by any kind of anti-imperialist leader, whether he's aligned with an Islamic-based movement or not. Very interesting and very effective speech, I would say, and one that will send, one that will keep the Washington, London, and Tel Aviv on the edge, which is exactly where you want them. Okay, so let's just catch up with some comments here. So, good afternoon to my comrade Ben Kavanagh, and Philbin, and Michael Hodgson, and Muniz, and HM, who says hello from Brighton. Irish Partisan says senior Croat, KLA, and Bosnian Muslim officials were never prosecuted for crimes of against humanity against Serbs and Roma by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. I think that's what that means. Whereas Serb and Yugoslav People's Army officers were pursued and prosecuted. Yes, I think the only Croats who were prosecuted were like incredibly they were mid-ranking officials. They never went after any of the army commanders in Croatia. So yeah, it's complete stitch-up job. But the point is that any of the like KLA, Bosnian officials, Croat officials could all have been prosecuted if they were applying these laws fairly, which they were never interested in doing. They all carried out so-called ethnic cleansing, but now ethnic cleansing is the official policy of not just Israel, it's the official policy of Britain and the official policy of the United States. It's always been that. I mean, my God, how many examples of ethnic cleansing were carried out during the period of the British Empire? An awful lot. I mean, let's look at the partition of India. That was designed to promote religious sectarianism and communal mass slaughter. And it's exactly what the British achieved by doing it. Their final parting gift, as they were being forced out of the country, was to divide it into 3 different countries in order to set the Indian populations against each other, in order that the British could maximise their own advantage, what advantages they did have, by utilising Pakistan, they hoped anyway. So, again, like the tactics of the Israelis are nothing new. It's all taken from American and British imperialism's tactics over the years. And one of the reasons they're so enthusiastic about defending Israel, and this is in their more honest moments, is because it's their last settler colonial project. Like, if you look back on how some of these people openly defended the racist regime in South Africa, for many years, you could find people in Britain, in the Conservative Party certainly, and a few in the Labour Party who would defend it, who would denounce the ANC, who would moan on about how the Afrikaner Republic there was a great example of European civilization. They defended it because it was an example of settler colonialism. Same with Rhodesia and the Ian Smith regime there. And one particular comparison I wanted to draw comrades' attention to is that at the very end, just before the revolutionary forces in what's now Zimbabwe triumphed, the British actually directly deployed a large amount of their own troops into the former Rhodesia in order to essentially try and control the situation and usher things towards a negotiated settlement. One way you could see the opening up of more direct American military bases inside Israel is an attempt to do something similar. Like, the American imperialists, bear in mind, for all their waffle at the moment about standing with Israel and all that, and indeed they do when it comes to slaughtering Palestinians, but they still don't want Netanyahu there. They still don't want the extremists. I mean, the kind of government Israel has now would be like if in the later period of apartheid South Africa, Eugene Terre Blanche took charge of the South African white minority government. I mean, that's the closest equivalent I can find to the kind of people in the Israeli government. The US imperialists don't really want them there, but they don't really know how to get rid of them either. So one of the things that I would bear in mind when the US is imposing more military control over Israel is that they're trying to get a handle on the situation themselves and trying to bring it under some kind of more effective management. Whether they'll be successful or not is another matter entirely, because you've got this what in any other circumstances in the West Bank would be regarded as essentially a third intifada going on right now, with again settler mobs expelling Palestinian villages and pogroms being carried out by the Israeli army, aerial bombardment being carried out by the Israeli Air Force on the West Bank. You've got a war over there as well that's being waged. So this is a war across all of the occupied, well, what's typically referred to as the occupied territories, all of the 1967 borders that a Palestinian state is supposed to be coming into existence under. So this is the state of things now, is that Nasrallah's comparison of Israel to being as weak as a spider's web is indeed a valid comparison. So, good afternoon to Jerry and Lord Charfield, and Irish Partisan says, Slobodan Milosevic employed many ethnic minorities, Hungarians and Croats within the upper echelons of the Yugoslav state and Yugoslav army, but he was accused of being behind the Greater Serbia project. Yeah, that was always a lie. Bear in mind, you can actually watch the Milosevic trial on I believe it's on the Internet Archive site. It's worth doing because he essentially, because he defended himself, he managed to make fools out of a lot of the prosecution witnesses who were accusing him of all kinds of things. I mean, maybe you could say that like Karadzic and people like that did have some sort of nationalist project that they were pursuing. But Milosevic, for all his flaws, and there were quite a number of them, wanted to actually preserve the integrity of the Yugoslav state, which is why he was villain number one. And I think certainly he made a lot of mistakes, but the reason why they wanted rid of him was because he wasn't prepared to break up what was left of Yugoslavia, and they needed to get rid of him to destroy what was left of Yugoslavia, which is why they color revolutioned him. He was one of the first to get that done to him, and why they essentially held a gun to the heads of the Serbian compradors and said, they held money in one hand and the gun in the other, and said, well, you can have one or the other, like a sort of gangster regime would. And if you give us Milosevic, we'll give you more aid. And I noticed that things are continuing to heat up inside the Balkan region, with more pressure being exerted on Vucic, who's this pretty pathetic character, in my view, very weak comprador regime that's being pressured to recognize Kosovo as an independent state, which of course he can't do openly for fear of a revolt inside Serbia, and to disengage from support for Republika Srpska inside Bosnia. So further problems inside Serbia itself there. I mean, what we're getting revealed now bit by bit by bit is just how empty and weak the political forces of places like the Serbian bourgeois really are. I mean, what the kind of politics that they have generated since the end of Milosevic's time in office has been just so feeble. I mean, you can criticize Milosevic for a number of things, and you know, I personally think that they could have, I think, scored more of a win in Kosovo, but they were betrayed by Yeltsin, and yeah, things could have reached a head there perhaps earlier, but again, Milosevic didn't have any allies. But the Serbian bourgeois are just completely pathetic. They're completely beholden to the US imperialists and the Europeans. The only way that Serbia is going to be preserved is by the Serbian masses themselves, who will have to, in the end, come together and throw out this clique that's been in power since the early 2000s, since the end of the Yugoslavian period. And they're going to have to essentially go up against NATO and go up against the collaborationist forces. And in my view, it's, even though this might be incredibly hard work, the rebirth of socialism in Yugoslavia is the only thing that's going to be able to actually save this entire Balkan region from being just dragged down into their chaos when the EU and NATO do go down, which they will do. They're weakening day by day and hour by hour. And the time for a reborn pan-Yugoslavian, pan-Balkan socialist project is now. And the first step would be perhaps the removal of the Comprador clique inside Belgrade. Because this can't go on, this pressure that they're putting Vucic under, because as one ex-Serbian government official who's been forced to resign said, if they acknowledge Kosovo as independent, if they then cut off Republika Srpska, the next demand will be the removal of all Chinese investment inside Serbia, which has been important over the last few decades. And the removal of, well, Russian influence in Serbia is, I would argue, is strong potentially on like an ideological level, but not on an economic level. So the next demand, as this guy said, was there will be the removal of all Chinese investment in Serbia, and then the removal of what's left of Serbian sovereignty. I mean, I cannot emphasize enough how much of a reactionary colonial organization the EU is. It's purely an entity run by the Germans as a subcontractor for US imperialism. It destroys nations. And I think that one of the things that would be useful to do is to talk about the concept of cosmopolitanism, nationalism, and socialist patriotism in the near future. That's something for us to talk about in terms of in relations to the Balkan discussion and some other things that have been going on as well. So I'll return to that. But I'll conclude this stream for today just by saying, be sure to, if you can, watch the Nasrallah speech. You can find the English translation on Press TV. Read it as well when the full text is released. Again, very interesting. I'll be doing a Q&A at some point soon, so feel free to send in questions on this. And tomorrow I may do a live stream because I'm at the celebration of the October Revolution, and that's going to be held in Bolivar Hall in London tomorrow, with speakers at this from my comrades in the CPGBML. My comrade Jyoti Brar is speaking there, together with representatives of, I believe, the Venezuelan government, I think the Nicaraguan government, the DPRK, and the Chinese government as well. So it's a very interesting selection of speakers. I'll do a live stream there after the event is finished. I believe the event will be being live streamed. If it is, I will put a link on the Telegram group so comrades can view it. And I'll do something live and on the spot afterwards as well. I'll be back online for a regular program on Sunday, where we'll be catching up with everything that's going on in the Middle East and with regard to Ukraine as well, because there's some important developments there that seem to be leading the Zelensky clique in the direction of destruction. We also need to catch up on the events in Armenia as well, because that's been rumbling on. Pashinyan is rapidly coming to a dead end. So, more on Sunday. I will see some of you live and in person tomorrow, and we'll do a live stream from the event just after it's finished. So, thank you to everybody who has tuned in today. I'll be back with you again over the course of the weekend. But until then, I'll say solidarity to you all.
Oh. Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kick them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they're ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.